Hello, I'm Paula. Welcome to Chadwick International. Today we're going to read two stories for the Seoul International Festival, Writers Festival, and
Hi, my name is Amy and I'm a senior in Chadwick.
Hi, I'm Kathleen and I'm also a senior.
Hello, my name is Angelina and I'm also a senior.
Hi, my name is Claudia and I'm also a senior.
Hi, I'm Anne and I'm also a senior.
I'm Paula.
I'm Sahar and I'm also a senior.
I'm Liu. I'm also a senior.
I'm Alex, and I'm also a senior.
Hi, I'm Ted. I am a senior.
Hello, my name is James. I am a senior.
Hi, I am Anne, and I'm also a senior.
Hi, I'm Isaac, and I'm also a senior.
Okay, so now that everybody's introduced themselves, we're going to start with a discussion of the inn, and we're going to start with the first question. The question is, while only in their teens, Florencia and Rocio seem invaded by a history that occurred decades before they were born. What does this story tell us about history and the way it continues to impact a place and people?
Let me start. So it's important for us to come to terms with history, and what's arguably more important is how we do that. In the end, there's a lot to do with what has to be forgotten or what wants to be forgotten. This is quite prevalent, as you can see, that the main conflict is about the inn and Elena's whole purpose and motive of trying to conceal the past of that. The past of the inn being a academy, police academy for the dictatorship 30 years ago, right? And in a way, there's a sort of enforcement of silence that's happening, not only to Rocio's father, but also to Rocio and Florencia indirectly. And we can see that Rocio and Florencia has a bitter and sort of, I guess, unresolved spot about that history, right? And that eventually leads to their suffering and the sort of the mishaps that happens. So we can see that clearly just trying to suppress history doesn't necessarily always result in the most positive outcome.
All right, just continuing on from there. Even just taking that lasting effect of the history, it was almost literally portrayed in the fact that Florencia and Rocio kind of experienced that specific history within just being on that bed, hearing the marching people, the headlights, the vibrations, etc. And even afterwards, Florencia mentions how, what if they came back again, even if she's not sure what exactly it was. So even after all the events have kind of happened, the impacts of it still kind of leave a residue, and people still kind of fear if it may happen again.
I would like to add on to that for the cause and effect, and also put a pin on how past can be a ghost that follows us around, and it always says it's in the past, put it behind, or it happened 40 years ago, you weren't even born, how does it affect you? But you need to remember, in any sort of very hard, impactful issues, even if you weren't born, like the 9/11, most of us weren't born yet, and yet we grew up for how people's responses was and their traumatizations from it. So it's in the same over here, where they were scared of what happened, and they're scared now that it can happen again, whether it's from others, whether there's more hatred or anything. It can always repeat. The past is a ghost for all of us.
Yeah, and if I could add on to what Jay and Zayn mentioned, like the theme of concealment and wanting to cover something up, I think is very prevalent throughout the story. Like the reason Florencia travels to this small town is because her father is running for a political position in the city they live in, and he doesn't want her little sister and the reputation she has to damage his political running. So he kind of wants to conceal her or almost hide her in this rural place. And then additionally, there's like the concealment of Florencia's like own romantic attraction towards her friend, and then obviously there's the concealment of wanting to hide the history of this inn, and these kind of three things that characters want to conceal but inadvertently aren't, that kind of flow together to this culmination when the two girls are scared by almost the history of this place that kind of came to life when they were there.
What I kind of find interesting about this story is that it presents sort of a binary between people that would like to know more about the history and people that would rather have it kind of put in the past in a way. And I know this can be seen within the characters of Florencia and Rocio, but I think it's also seen between the relationship of the tourists versus the owner of the tour place, because the tourists, once they're informed of the past of the inn, are a little bit more curious to know a little bit more about it because it used to be a police academy. But the owner of the tourism place would rather have that history kind of muted and not talked about because it was so awful, right? So I feel like that representation of that binary between should we know a little bit more about our history, should we acknowledge that it occurred, or should we just put it in the past and move forward without that acknowledgement? So I feel like that representation was very interesting to see within the story.
I personally thought one interesting thing is the method this story portrays how history impacts people. And I think this shows like psychologically they try to suppress the history, or there's some people who want to know the history, so that's the impact. But there's also physical impacts because the girls feel that they actually experienced it directly, and they also feel like they saw ghosts. So I think this shows that history can continue to impact people both physically and psychologically.
I think just sort of connecting with what everyone else has been saying, because I really resonated with that. I think in the story, a great example of that is with Florencia and Rocio's relationship, because in Argentina in the past, there were these dictators who would oppress LGBTQ plus civil rights, and because of that, you can kind of see how in the story contextually it can be interpreted as the shadows of like people banging against the glass and stuff as the hauntings of those oppression that builds up over history and how it affects the girls today, and how it feels like sometimes you never really know, oh, are these like, is that like discrimination going to come back? Like, how is my civil rights going to be protected? And I think that's a very nice way to sort of interpret the story.
Just what she mentioned, I also wanted to show, or well, tell what I thought about the sisters. How I think it was on the last page that she said to Florencia, tell me or else. And she kept fighting until she was threatened by being outed. And even in her sister being her own generation, you can still see the effects of oppression and how close-minded people think and act towards others.
That concludes our discussion of the inn. We will now move on to the discussion about the next story, which is titled The Bookmaking Habits of Select Species. Now that we've finished the discussion about the inn, we'll move on to the discussion of the second story, which is titled The Bookmaking Habits of Select Species. The question that we'll be discussing is as follows. This story is an allegorical reflection on writing and interpretation. At the end, it concludes, they read without knowing, they are reading. Everyone makes books. What does this mean, and how does this story illustrate this idea?
So in this book, it discussed different species and how their methods of reading and writing like books. And it seems like all species have like different definition of writing or books. So I thought their like distinctiveness tells us that our way of story is all different, and how we are defining story could be all different. But then that makes up the story, and which means everyone makes their own story and their own books.
Alright, just adding on to it, everyone makes books does actually appear at the beginning of the story as well. So it's just kind of encompassing that whole idea of everybody like seeks to record something, to keep something of like memory or past together, and in doing so writes or remembers or reads in some way. Even with the Karui who don't actually record anything, rather just use forgotten relics to build their societies on. In a sense, they are able to still somehow recover like an echo of it and repurpose it into a similar thing that members of the species that once used those to record could now find familiar. So in that sense, no matter how it's recorded, everybody does read, in a sense, figuring out what something used to be, what something is, and records it in a way that a book might be wrote.
I think that all of us, and by that I mean beings, just breathing, living things, we have the really big question, and I think we all know that we are gonna die. Every species knows that. And one of the biggest fears people or animals face is being forgotten. And I think that by saying everybody writes books is that we all each make up our own story as we go on, unknowingly. And we want to remember something. We want to be remembered by someone, something, or animals, whoever. We want to let someone know that we were here and that that's our story. And humans have done that even before we could write with the alphabet. You can go into caves that have images that if you flicker with a light, it'll be animated, or symbols that we don't understand, but back then it was their own language. We all have books because we all need to be remembered, or we all want to, essentially.
I also noticed that we can relate this to the real world context because, for example, the author talks about species, and we can relate that to different cultures around the world. Maybe different species, like we have seen in the book, have different ways of writing and explaining their life experiences, and maybe we can relate that to different cultures around the world. Every country has different languages and different ways that they wanted to keep showing knowledge to their people. So I think this is a really good interpretation that I did. Actually, it's really nice to think in that way that we can relate it to a real world context and see that the main aim of this is just to share knowledge to our other generations.
The way I kind of interpreted this last statement is kind of how the author was trying to, like, intending to say that gathering knowledge or passing down knowledge it can be unconscious rather than conscious. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, this is a book, I'm going to read it and I'm going to pass down knowledge. It can be somewhat unconscious saying, oh, I'm reading this and I'm getting knowledge, and you're not necessarily aware of the fact that you're doing that. And I like the point that was brought up about different cultures having different methods of doing that, because I feel like that is definitely true within this world. And I like how the author represented different methods of gathering knowledge, where it doesn't necessarily have to be, oh, this is the correct way to gather knowledge and this is the correct way to do it. It's more like up to interpretation and up to personal preference to do that. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yes, I want to add on to what Lee just said. I really liked and thought was interesting how, like, the way the author decided to define books or the act of reading. Because when we usually just think about books, it's usually just paper and story written on the paper. But the way the author describes books or the act of reading or writing here is not just writing letters on a book. Instead, it's the act of sharing knowledge and spreading knowledge throughout generations, throughout history. And he does it so by showing us different representative examples of different species. But eventually, it all comes back to the question of how history or story is passed throughout generations, and how we interpret it it all changes and it's all different in different places of the world or different species, but it's like an act that is continuing in sorts. And I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, so we can definitely agree that the various species that appear in this story is, fictional. But like from what we're right now talking about, we can definitely understand, right? They feel somewhat real. The reasons that they write, the reasons, right? The connections between speech and writing, the role of thinking, the role of logic, right? Like to read but not to really record, right? Those are things that, in a way, we humans do. So the bottom line is, they are fictional, yes, but they do have occasional commonalities and differences with us humans. And this kind of makes me think, right? The fact that we can understand this, does it say anything about us? And while many ideas of this has been but I sort of thought in relation to that quote, right? Everyone makes books. Maybe like that sort of curiosity of creation, right? Not just writing, but like the previous speaker just mentioned, on a wider scope, really anything, right? Maybe it is something that's timeless. Maybe it's something that's universal. So maybe it is something much more greater, right, than just something that belongs to us.
I agree with James on the point that it all comes down to the idea of documentation and recording history. And I also thought that it was creative for the author to imagine ways beyond our way of reading and writing, and that these species have other ways of reading and writing where they have their own effective methods.
There is no definitive census that of all the intelligent species in the universe. But there is one thing that brings all of them together, and it's the tendency to kind of remember or try to preserve what's been left behind. While some may live as a memory itself, like the Quadzoli, or whether even the Hespero, who still, although reluctantly, still preserve their memories in a sense that even though they don't write, they do contain and store memories.
My thought sort of goes back to what Liu said, because I also interpreted reading as a conscious process, and I thought that the term reading in this passage is more about the process of gaining knowledge and the want to continue learning. So their forms may differ, and the example that I want to refer to is the stone grains of the Quatzolis. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, but because their brains are passed on to people generation in the future, and I think this shows that learning is a process of collecting knowledge and then sharing it to the future generations.
And I think something I found really beautiful about reading the story is just how it captures how we as humans and even beyond humans, they use aliens as an example, and I think that's a great way of showing how not just humans, maybe even animals in this real world context, we all want this idea of being remembered, like Paula said, which was really well phrased. And I think that's just really well written in that sense. In addition to that, I also felt the style of writing, where it was sort of like a documentary or a scientific writing, it really added to the world building of the story in general, which was another thing that I absolutely loved, because it made the sense of different cultures versus different aliens to feel very well blended within the story, which makes it a lot easier to connect as we read the story.
I actually want to add on to this because the question said everyone makes books, and we have been talking about how stories passed down from generation with the purpose of sharing knowledge, but rather I think about how not everyone can read every single stories around the world. Some of us actually choose books we want to dive in more instead of like read every single book. So maybe I think how about like books help us construct our sense of identity almost.
In terms of like stylistic and structural elements, I think this contributed to the meaning that the author wanted to convey, so that like this book has lots of like conceptual and symbolic meaning within like as it's written in like fiction genre, and I think this allows us like the audience to reflect on and what these species are trying to convey to us, and from this like our own interpretations, it allows us to reflect back on our history and how we create our own books, and I think the author wanted us to reflect how we are creating books based on this stylistic and structural elements.
Yeah, kind of adding on to the discussion about the stylistic choice of the author, I also really enjoyed how it was written in third person and how the author was speaking more in an objective way as opposed to a judgmental way, because I feel like it just presented facts as opposed to specific opinions, and there was no judgment saying, oh, this method is better than the other one. It was more a presentation of certain facts and the interpretation of which way is better or which method each individual prefers is more up to the interpretation of the readers. So I found that very interesting as well.
I also thought about that and how, at the end of the day, it uses aliens and species, and we can compare it to animals, but we are all the same, essentially. We are all alive, and we want to document our history, and like I said before, be remembered.
Okay, now that we've finished the discussion of both stories, it would be good to kind of bridge those two together. And both of these stories seem to reflect back to the way history has impacted our present. So what do you guys think about how stories use history to deepen a reader's perspective?
I think previous knowledge we all have impacts on how we view the world, or if you read a book and it has the past that you can relate to, or others have gone through it, it helps you understand them a bit better, if we could even try and understand others.
To me, I think both stories use history as an important element, but they use it in different ways. In history, it's kind of this overlooming thing that impacts the events of the story from the past. Like the characters experience the horrors that happened in this military academy almost 40 years later. While in the second story, history is used almost like as a lens through which to view the current from the future. Because we understand what's going to happen in the future, which will eventually become history, we have a deeper understanding of the significance of the events happening concurrently or throughout the events of the book. Because we know what will happen after them, we can appreciate them more.
Yeah, in both stories, in my opinion, there's a sort of fundamental question that they're tackling, and that is, how do we want to be remembered? Right? In the end, we have characters who have something they want to hide or something that they must hide, and we have this place that is being very fiercely contended over its past. And in the bookmaking habits of select species, the story revolves around the various unique ways in which different species are trying to record their history, record their ideas and thoughts. So in both stories, there's a discussion of whether or not what we leave on history is just pertaining to us, or whether or not it has a much greater significance beyond ourselves. And I think, in a way, to the readers, that makes us think, oh yeah, what is that history we're trying to make, right? And what would that have? What effect would that have?
I kind of want to extend from what James was saying. I feel like the essential role of literature is really to just ask the readers questions that will possibly broaden their perspective or bring other ideas into the discussion. And I feel like both of these stories are doing a great job in asking this question of how history should be portrayed or interpreted. So, for example, in the Inn, I feel like the author was asking the question of whether some histories are better to be hidden or like concealed, or whether they should all be portrayed the way they are, and then it is up to our interpretation to interpret it. And then I feel like the author is not really giving us like a definitive answer to that, and just leaving us space to kind of think about that. And in the second story by Ken Liu, I feel like he's just kind of showing us different ways on how history is passed on and portrayed. And instead of making like a biased opinion on that or giving judgments about it, instead he kind of portrays like various ways that can be possibly interpreted into different ways we humans portray history or pass on history, but does not go into much of a judgment saying which one's better or which one's correct. Instead, kind of embraces the whole method and methods that we use to portray history. So I think both stories are really important in that it asks us a question about how history should be interpreted.
Yeah, so I guess what I wanted to say was both stories kind of portray the idea of whether we want to or not, history will always kind of be there. Where in something like The Inn, no matter what people try to hide or try to forget about, in Sanagasta, that history still remains. The Barak-like buildings, the flashbacks, and just kind of like being so defensive about what happened in the past. It gives a sense of like the past is haunting us. While in this the bookmarking habits of select species, it kind of goes in a different direction, that we are actually pursuing the past in the sense that we are kind of looking towards to finding out what was the past, since we do know what the future will be, and that is nothing.
All right, thank you everybody for participating, and thank you everybody for your opinions. We would just like to say thank you for the Seoul International Writers Festival for giving us this opportunity to have a discussion about these stories, which we found very interesting. So we'd just like to say thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you.